Welcome to the Parts Management Podcast. Today I'm going to be interviewing Chuck Hartley. Welcome, Chuck.
Hi, Kaylee.
So, this series, I want to talk about how the parts managers are just as important as the sales department. And I think that's a great overarching topic to talk about because a lot of what we do or what we see is there's some overlap with like the used cars and parts management. So, first, we're going to do role comparison. How would you compare the roles and responsibilities of a parts manager to maybe a used car manager?
Well, one of the things at a dealership that just about everybody knows is a dealer typically only has two assets in their dealership: used cars and parts that they're buying and selling on a regular basis. Used car or new cars are floored. You pay flooring costs and things like that, where a lot of dealerships, when they get used cars in, they own it. So one of the big differences, and I learned this working in the dealership and being involved a little bit with knowing the used car managers and whatnot, is they lived by one mantra, and that was your first loss is your best loss. So in other words, any used cars that sat around for more than 60 days, so to speak, we're going to wholesale that out and try and break even on it or whatever. Nobody's looking at it, nobody's selling it. Well, when you think on a parts aspect, if they could treat that like your first loss was your best loss from a parts aspect, dealing with thousands of part numbers instead of a handful of used cars, is looking at the ordering process and what you're putting in stock and so forth. In other words, what is ordered is needed. That's a critical step, and it starts with the parts manager, but it trickles down to the parts advisors and even more importantly, the service department. That the service department isn't over ordering parts, or if you're large and wholesale, that you don't have people who are sending parts back all the time, large wholesale body shops sending parts back. Those are the types of things that you try and combat. And that's where comparing, a sales manager to a parts manager, they have a lot of comparisons. For years, they've always said, in the back end of the dealership. Well, I think the political correctness now is the fixed operations department. And that's changed a lot in the last few years because fixed operations tends to make more money than the sales operations. So, you
Yeah,
know,
and we'll get to that. I want
yeah.
to ask you too, what are some unique challenges that parts managers face that maybe the sales department or the sales manager doesn't encounter?
In a lot of cases, especially with automatic stock replenishment programs such as Arrow and Rim, the parts managers don't have the ability to put the kind of inventory in that they'd like to. Some instances, to remain compliant, they're putting parts in that, of course, in the name of breadth and sales control. Remember, the manufacturer only guarantees what sells, but they also put a lot of parts on the shelf, as we've seen, Kaylee, that don't sell. They're marginal. Well, in the name of breadth, the good news is it's guaranteed, but you keep it on your shelf for 12 months and then we'll take it back. So controlling the inventory from that aspect, you can still look at the good part. Okay, it's great. But on the back end of it, what you really have to control are the parts that aren't guaranteed by the manufacturer. And that's where we've certainly seen over the last few years with these programs, they just don't have return allowance or the ability to get rid of idle capital. And so you really have to plan for that. And that's a new role for the parts manager now, is really, shoring up their ordering, looking for ways to accrue money, to purge obsolescence. Because let's face it, Kaylee, you're never going to get rid of, the utopia for car dealerships would be to have 100% of their inventory guaranteed. And with the exception of a couple of manufacturers we've seen out there, the average is about 25 to 30% of the inventory is guaranteed. That other 70% has really become kind of a boat anchor and idle capital for dealers. And that's where educating parts managers and getting them to be forward thinking about those parts is what's going to be really critical for them. And that's a lot different than a used car manager. Used car manager, they're deciding, hey, this is a good new used vehicle. When they take the trade in, they can make that decision, or they can go to an auction and they get to buy what they want. Parts managers don't have that ability anymore, with the exception of a couple of makes. So pretty much are controlled by the manufacturer, and they just have to be really careful about the parts that aren't guaranteed.
Yes, that's important. Not the correct mindset is like, oh, my manufacturer tells me what to stock and I don't have to worry about it. And I think you're describing quite the opposite of you really have to pay close attention to that 70% that's not protected.
Well, and we've seen, look at all the dealers, Kaylee, that we've seen that they've lived by that. Oh, the manufacturer takes care of everything. We don't have to worry about it. And the first thing we do when we go in there is we see a tremendous amount of obsolescence. And the dealer, and in some cases, the parts manager, they go, well, we have no control over that. Well, they do. But, the manufacturers have done a pretty good job in convincing the dealers that you don't really need to order anything or put anything on the shelves that we don't guarantee. And that's just not true.